March 2004. The basement in Fallujah still smelled of cordite and fear. Inside the concrete ruins, 19-year-old Ahmed Hassan crouched beside his younger cousin, both waiting to die as martyrs like they'd been taught. They'd been told Americans tortured prisoners, that surrender meant dishonor worse than death. But when the enemy medic found them, he didn't raise his M4 rifle. He knelt down, pulled out medical supplies, spoke soft words they couldn't understand, and then he did something that shattered everything Ahmed believed. He smiled and handed his cousin an MRE crackers pack. Iraqi insurgent fighters couldn't believe Americans spared their lives and treated them with dignity. The enemy wasn't supposed to have rules, wasn't supposed to show mercy. But if everything they'd been taught was a lie, what else had they gotten wrong? Before we dive in, if you want more incredible untold stories from recent conflicts that challenge everything you thought you knew, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories reach. The basement smelled like smoke and desperation. Ahmed Hassan pressed his back against the cold concrete wall, one hand gripping his younger cousin's shoulder, the other clutching an IED trigger he'd been given 6 months ago when he was still 18, and naive enough to believe in jihad. Omar's breathing came in shallow gasps beside him, his shoulder wound bleeding through the makeshift bandage Ahmed had torn from his own keffiyeh. Outside, American voices called out in that harsh foreign language, words Ahmed didn't understand, but recognized as surrender demands. "Cousin," Omar whispered, his 17-year-old face gray in the dim light filtering through the basement entrance. "I'm sorry." Ahmed's throat tightened. Sorry for what? For following him into this nightmare? For volunteering when he could have stayed home with his grandmother, safe in Baghdad? Ahmed had promised to protect him, had sworn on their fathers' graves that he'd bring Omar home. Now they were trapped in a concrete tomb in Fallujah, waiting for the end, like every other Iraqi fighter who'd been taught that capture meant Abu Ghraib, and that death was the only honorable escape. The American voices grew closer. Ahmed's fingers trembled on the trigger. Imam al-Zarqawi's words echoed in his skull, drilled into him during those brutal training months. The Crusaders show no mercy. They will defile your body and shame your family. Choose martyrdom. Choose honor. Ahmed had seen the photographs, or what they'd been told were photographs of tortured Iraqi prisoners, their bodies displayed like trophies. He'd been given the trigger for this exact moment, one press. Both cousins gone in an instant. Quick, clean, honorable. But Omar's hand found his in the darkness, cold and trembling and so terribly alive. "Ahmed," Omar breathed, and there was something in his voice that wasn't quite fear. Maybe permission, maybe trust, maybe just exhaustion. "Whatever you choose, I'm with you." The footsteps stopped just outside the basement entrance. Ahmed could see shadows moving against the harsh Iraqi sunlight, could hear the metallic click of weapons being readied. This was it. The moment Imam al-Zarqawi had prepared them for the moment every sermon, every beating, every shame-filled lecture had been building toward. His thumb rested on the trigger. Then a voice called out, different from the others, younger maybe, and speaking careful, broken Arabic with an accent so thick Ahmed almost didn't understand. "We have medic. We have water. You are hurt. We will help." Ahmed's breath stopped. Help, the word didn't make sense. Enemies didn't help. Enemies tortured and killed and turned your body into propaganda. That's what he'd been taught. That's what everyone knew. "It's a trick," Ahmed hissed to Omar, but his voice cracked on the last word. cousin. Omar's grip tightened on his hand. I'm dying anyway. What if it's not? The question hung in the darkness between them, like an IED of its own, ready to detonate everything Ahmed thought he knew. He looked at Omar, really looked, and saw the blood seeping faster now. Saw his cousin's lips turning the wrong color. Saw death creeping in whether he pressed the trigger or not. Imam al-Zarqawi had never said what to do if the choice wasn't between honor and shame. He'd never said what to do if the choice was between a lie you believed and a cousin you loved. Ahmed's hand opened. The trigger rolled across the basement floor, settling in rubble where it couldn't hurt anyone. His voice, when it came, sounded like someone else's. Someone who'd already died and been replaced by a stranger wearing his face. "We surrender," he called out in Arabic, not knowing if they'd understand, not caring anymore. "My cousin is wounded. Please." The word please felt like swallowing glass. But Omar sagged against him with something that might have been relief, and the American voices outside went quiet for a moment that lasted forever. Then footsteps approached, and Ahmed closed his eyes, waiting for the bullet that would prove he'd been right to fear them, that would punish him for choosing wrong. Instead, gentle hands reached into the darkness. Ahmed woke to whiteness. Not the blinding flash he'd expected from death, but the gentler white of medical tent walls and clean bandages. His body ached in places he'd forgotten could hurt. Each breath a reminder that he was somehow impossibly still breathing. Beside him, on a cot barely 2 feet away, Omar slept deeply, his chest rising and falling in steady rhythm. The bandage on his shoulder was fresh, professionally wrapped, and Ahmed's mind struggled to process this. His cousin's face had color in it again. An American soldier sat in a folding chair near the tent entrance, reading a letter with the absorbed attention of someone far from home. His rifle leaned against his chair, close enough to grab, but not pointed, not threatening. When he noticed Ahmed watching, he didn't shout or reach for his weapon. He just nodded once, then went back to his letter, as if guarding enemy prisoners was no more remarkable than guarding supply tents. Ahmed's stomach cramped with confusion. Where was the interrogation? Where were the electric cables? And the questions screamed into his face. Imam al-Zarqawi had described American brutality in exquisite detail. The beatings, the waterboarding, the casual cruelty of men who didn't see Iraqi fighters as human. But the tent smelled like antiseptic and something cooking. And when a medic appeared with 2 bottles of water, he smiled at him. Actually smiled like he was a patient instead of a prisoner. Like his kafia didn't mark him as someone who'd been trying to kill his countrymen 48 hours ago. "Drink," he said in English, gesturing to the bottle. And though he didn't understand the word, he understood the meaning. The water was cool, real. He waited for it to be poisoned, waited for the trick to reveal itself. But Omar stirred and reached for his bottle without hesitation, and Ahmed couldn't let his cousin drink alone. The first taste made his eyes burn. It wasn't the shame of surrender, though that sat in his chest like swallowed stones, but something more complicated, more dangerous. It was the realization that the water was clean, that the medic had brought enough for both of them, that no one had spit in it or laced it with chemicals. It was the terrible traitorous understanding that maybe, just maybe, everything he'd been taught was wrong. The transport helicopter to the detention facility flew over brown Iraqi desert, and Ahmed sat inside surrounded by dozens of other Iraqi prisoners. Boys and men, most of them thin, all of them alive. He watched for the beatings to start for the torture Imam al-Zarqawi had promised. But instead, an American officer appeared with an interpreter, an Iraqi-American soldier whose face looked like home, but whose uniform marked him as enemy or ally or something Ahmed had no words for. Geneva Convention rules, the interpreter explained in perfect Arabic, and then listed things that sounded like fantasy. Names recorded, Red Cross visits, legal representation, medical care. You are prisoners of war, not criminals. There are rules. Ahmed wanted to laugh. Rules. As if war had rules, as if enemies followed them. But around him, other prisoners were nodding, whispering to each other with something that looked dangerously like hope. And Omar squeezed his arm with a grip that said, "See, cousin, see." At the facility, razor wire enclosed them just as Ahmed expected, but inside the wire sat things that made no sense. A mess hall where actual food appeared 3 times daily. Latrines that didn't overflow with disease. An open space where American soldiers were setting up something that looked suspiciously like a soccer field. An older prisoner, Major Rashid, approached Ahmed during the first evening lineup. His face was weathered, his eyes tired but sharp. "I've been here 3 weeks," Rashid said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of a career soldier confronting impossible truth. "They follow the rules." "I didn't know enemies could have rules." Sergeant Rodriguez, the medic from the soccer game, showed Ahmed photos of his family farm in Texas during one of these sessions, his fingers gentle on the worn pictures. "My parents are from Mexico," he said through the interpreter, though his face said more than words could. "We know what it's like when people see you as the enemy." The package from the Red Cross arrived on a Tuesday that felt like every other Tuesday until it wasn't. Letters, photos, news from home. Omar's hands shook as he opened the envelope addressed in their grandmother's careful script, and Ahmed read over his shoulder, his heart climbing into his throat with each word. "I am alive, staying with neighbors in Baghdad. I received your letter. I pray for you every day. Come home when you can. I forgive everything." Ahmed read it 17 times. That night, for the first time in a year, he slept without nightmares. December 2005 arrived like a hammer through glass. The facility gathered in the mess hall for an announcement. Hundreds of prisoners pressed shoulder to shoulder, and Ahmed felt Omar's hand find his in the crowd, the way it had in the basement all those weeks ago. The American commander stood at the front with the interpreter, and his face carried something Ahmed had learned to read in these months of captivity. Not cruelty, but the exhausted weight of a man delivering news he wished he didn't have to speak. "Iraq is holding elections," the interpreter said in Arabic. And the word should have brought relief, should have meant democracy. But the interpreter's voice shook on what came next. "The violence is escalating. Sunni-Shia civil war, thousands dead daily, neighborhoods ethnically cleansed." The mess hall went silent in a way that had nothing to do with discipline and everything to do with the human mind trying to comprehend the incomprehensible. Civil war, sectarian killing. Ahmed's grandmother's neighbors were mixed Sunni-Shia. Their street had been peaceful, might not exist anymore in any form that mattered. The careful letters he'd been writing, the hope he'd been building one soccer game and one English lesson at a time, all of it collapsed like a house of cards in fire. He'd been saved from death only to learn his homeland was tearing itself apart. What was the point? What had his surrender bought except the knowledge that while he'd been eating hot meals and learning to say thank you in English, his people had been slaughtering each other in the name of God and sect? Imam al-Zarqawi's voice rose in his head, triumphant even in memory. You should have died as a martyr. You should have pressed that trigger. Ahmed stopped eating, stopped attending Rashid's English classes, stopped writing letters to a grandmother who might not have neighbors to stay with anymore, who might be wandering through sectarian ruins looking for family that no longer had bodies to bury. Omar tried to reach him. We're alive, cousin. Grandmother is alive. But the words slid off Ahmed like water off stone. He'd made the wrong choice. He could see it now with horrible clarity. He'd chosen shame and survival. And for what? So he could live while thousands died daily. He found himself at the fence one evening staring through razor wire at a sunset that had no right to be beautiful. When Major Rashid appeared beside him, the older man didn't speak for a long time, just stood there watching the sky bleed orange and purple. And Ahmed was grateful for the silence that didn't demand anything from him. I was told my death would protect Iraq, Rashid said finally, his voice quiet enough that only Ahmed could hear. But Iraq needs survivors, not martyrs. The country that's left needs to be rebuilt, and the dead can't do that. He turned to look at Ahmed, and his eyes held decades of service, of loyalty, of choices that had seemed simple until they weren't. You saved your cousin. That's not shame. That's strength. The Americans could have killed us. They didn't. That matters. What you do with this life now, that's what will honor the ones who didn't make it. Marcus found Ahmed the next morning holding an envelope that had arrived in the night's mail delivery. He didn't say anything, just offered it and sat down beside Ahmed on the barrack steps while Ahmed opened it with shaking hands. His grandmother's handwriting covered the page, and Ahmed's vision blurred as he read, "The fighting is terrible. Different than we hoped, but some neighborhoods stay peaceful. Your uncle's family moved to safety. We are alive. You and Omar are my victory. Come home. We will rebuild together." The paper crumpled in his fists, and Marcus sat there in silence, not trying to fix anything, not offering false comfort, just present, just there. And Ahmed understood something then about the medic who'd pulled him from that basement, about the soldier who'd smiled while giving water, about Rodriguez showing photos of his family, about guards who learned Arabic and played soccer with prisoners. Presence was kindness. Mercy wasn't weakness. Rules mattered because without them, humans became monsters. Shukran, Ahmed whispered in Arabic. Thank you, one of the first phrases Rashid had taught him, words he'd practiced but never quite trusted until now. Marcus nodded, understanding more than language could carry. You're welcome, he said, and stayed until Ahmed's breathing steadied until the weight shifted enough that Ahmed could imagine standing up again. Preparations for release began in March 2006, and the facility that had been Ahmed's prison and sanctuary started coming apart at the seams. American soldiers dismantled the soccer field first, pulling up goals and rolling away the nets. And Ahmed watched from the barracks window, feeling a loss he had no right to feel. He wasn't ready to leave, not out of love for captivity, but because here, in this strange liminal space between war and peace, he'd learned something true that he didn't know how to carry back into the world. Here, enemies had chosen mercy. Here, rules had mattered more than revenge. How did he explain that to an Iraq that had been taught Americans were crusaders? How did he explain it to himself? Marcus found him on the last day carrying something wrapped in brown paper. The medic's face looked older than his 24 years, carved by grief and responsibility, and too many kids who died despite his gentle hands. He held out the package, and when Ahmed unwrapped it, he found a small Quran, the leather cover worn soft from use, and an inscription in careful Arabic that Ahmed had learned enough to read. To Ahmed, may you find peace. Marcus Rodriguez, El Paso. My brother carried one, Marcus said through Rodriguez, who'd volunteered to interpret this last conversation in Afghanistan. I don't know if it helped, but I want you to have it. Marcus pulled out a photograph, then two young men in civilian clothes, arms slung around each other's shoulders, grinning with the careless joy of people who didn't know war was coming. That's Miguel and me before, Marcus said. And Ahmed heard all the weight that single word carried. Before death, before grief, before knowing that MRE crackers and bandages couldn't save everyone. I want you to remember, we're all someone's cousin, someone's son. Ahmed's throat closed around words he didn't have in English and wasn't sure he had in Arabic either. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the photograph he'd carried through training, through battle, through surrender, his grandmother's face, younger and unlined, smiling at whoever held the camera. He'd kept it through everything. This small square of paper that proved home was real, that love existed outside of war. He pressed it into Marcus's hand. So you remember too, Ahmed managed in halting English, and Marcus's eyes went bright with tears. Neither of them would let fall. The transport convoy cut through Iraqi desert toward a Baghdad that existed only in imagination now. Not the capital they'd left, not the homeland propaganda had promised, but something new and wounded and uncertain. Ahmed sat in the Humvee with Omar, watching the cityscape emerge from desert haze. The neighborhoods were scarred, the streets crowded with American checkpoints, the whole city bearing visible wounds that would take generations to heal. But it was still there, still home. What will we tell them? Omar asked, his voice carrying the same question Ahmed had been asking himself for weeks. About the Americans? Ahmed thought of the soccer game, of Rodriguez's family photos, of Rashid's English classes, and the medic's smile and the water that hadn't been poisoned. He thought of Marcus's steady hands changing Omar's bandages, of the MRE crackers that had shattered everything Ahmed believed, of the rules that had kept them alive when death would have been easier. He thought of the Quran in his pocket and Miguel Rodriguez's face in a photograph and the terrible, beautiful truth that enemies could choose to be human. The truth, Ahmed said. We'll tell them the truth. They arrived at the checkpoint, and their grandmother waited at the gate, thin, aged by war in ways that had nothing to do with years, but alive. So impossibly alive. She ran to them the moment they cleared security, and Ahmed felt her arms around him like a question answered, like forgiveness he hadn't earned, but needed desperately. I'm sorry I surrendered, he whispered into her hijab, the shame he'd been carrying since the basement. Finally finding words, she pulled back, cupped his face with hands that had written letters to grandsons she thought were dead, that had held hope when hope was the hardest thing to carry. You saved your cousin. You came home. That's all that matters. They walked into Baghdad together, 3 survivors among thousands, moving through rubble toward whatever came next. Children played in bombed-out buildings. Women swept debris from doorways. Old men planted gardens in crater dirt. Rebuilding all of them, rebuilding. And Ahmed heard Major Rashid's words like a promise. What you do with this life now, that's what will honor the ones who didn't make it.